Today, you're going to learn how to go from the basic levels of English up to the intermediate levels of English. I'm going to give you a simple and practical study plan. Here we go. First, before we start, you need to understand the different levels of English. So first of all, there is the A0 or A1 level, which is for absolute beginners or people who are at the elementary level of English. Now, this would describe you if you can understand very basic words, very basic phrases, very basic expressions in the English language. However, you still struggle to really use them and apply them to everyday life. Next is the A2 level of English, which we would call pre-intermediate. Now, if you're at the A2 level of English, that means you can understand basic expressions and you can also communicate them in a very simple way. This could mean ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions and giving directions to someone who asks you. This would describe you if you're at the pre-intermediate level. Next is the B1 level of English, which is the intermediate level. Now, at the B1 level, this corresponds to people who can understand but also use text on familiar topics, subjects that they are pretty familiar with and pretty comfortable with. That's pretty much applicable to the things that they do in their everyday life. Now, when you get up from B1 to the B2 level of English, which is the upper intermediate level, this means you can have conversations spontaneously about all the things that you are familiar with and even some other things that you aren't familiar with. At the B2 level, I would say this is when you could pretty much call yourself fluent in the English language. And then the other three levels, which we won't get into in this video, would be the C1 level, which is advanced levels of English, which means you can communicate about pretty much anything easily and fluently. The native speaking level, which are native English speakers who learned the language by heart when they were born. And then the C2 level, which I would put above native speakers, which is English proficiency, meaning you can communicate and understand pretty much anything in the English language, and you can communicate it very easily and very comfortably. And you understand the nuanced differences and details and different definitions about most, if not all, of the most commonly used words, expressions, phrases, idioms, and slang terms in the English language. Now, to get from the beginner levels up to the B2 level, let's take a look at what exactly it will take and what are the main differences between the A1 and A2 levels versus the B1 and B2 levels. First of all, there's a huge difference between the amount of vocabulary words that could be understood and used by someone at the B2 level versus the A1 or A2 levels. So for example, at the A1 level, people usually know around 700 vocabulary words. At the A2 level, they usually know around 1,500 words. And then at the B1 level, they usually know around 2,500. And then at B2, it's around 4,000. Usually to go from A1 to A2, it usually takes around 100 to 200 study hours. To go from A2 to B1, it's usually around 350 to 400. And from B1 to B2, around 500 to 600 hours of study. Now, as mentioned before, people at the A1 and A2 levels can use very basic expressions and phrases, and maybe you can get by when it comes to things that are necessities or required for everyday life. However, the B1 and B2 levels, that's when you can really start to call yourself fluent in the English language. Now let's go over 5 specific steps that you're going to need to take if you want to reach and achieve the B2 level of English. Step number 1, you're going to need to figure out the skill that you need to improve upon the most. So for example, if you're really good at listening to English and if you're really good at reading English, but you have a hard time speaking and articulating yourself, then of course you need to put more of an emphasis on improving your speaking skills over your listening and reading skills moving forward. This does not mean neglect your reading and listening skills. This just means practice your speaking more than the other skills. The same thing goes if you're comfortable articulating yourself, but you have a hard time understanding native speakers. This leads to step number 2, which is you need to create a morning and or an evening routine that you know that you can commit to. When it comes to learning English or really just any language, it is absolutely imperative. It's very important that you remain consistent for as long as possible. Even if you only practice for 5 minutes per day, 10 minutes per day, or 30 minutes a day, or 10 hours per day, you need to find a routine that you can stay consistent with. To give you some examples, this could involve reading something as soon as you wake up in the morning and listening to something before you go to bed at night in the English language. You could also work on your speaking when you're in the shower by simply practicing expressing your thoughts and expressing what's on your mind out loud in the English language. This leads to step number 3, which is you need to find a practical method to learn the English language. Now, in 2024, the year that this video was recorded, there are so many different ways and so many different tools that you can use out there to learn the English language. People have different preferences for how they learn based on their lifestyle. Some people are very busy, so they like to use certain applications. Some people have more time, so they like to use old school and old fashioned ways of learning the English language. Among tutors, applications, online, and in person English schools, you need to find a practical method that's going to work for you and your particular lifestyle. Now, to get more specific, step number 4 is you need to steadily improve each and every skill of the English language. As mentioned earlier, you should put an emphasis on the skills that you need to improve upon the most. However, this does not mean neglecting the other skills. You still need to make an advancement on all of the different skills in English as you are studying. These skills being vocabulary, grammar, reading, listening, speaking, and writing. Now, there are two main ways that you should be improving your vocabulary at the beginner levels of the English language. The first way is by listening to media where you can understand most of what is being said, and you're using English subtitles as well to help you out. By doing this, you'll be able to associate the words on the screen with what is actually happening in the video. This is going to make vocabulary a lot easier to remember if you can associate some sort of imagery or visual with the words that you're learning. Another easy way to improve your vocabulary at the beginner level is to use an application such as LingQ. This simply just involves reading texts. They can also play the audio as you read, and if you come across any word that you do not understand, you can just click on it and it will translate it back into your native language. I don't really recommend doing this at the intermediate levels, but to get from the beginner levels to the intermediate levels, this can definitely save you a ton of time from trying to research and look up every single word that you don't understand when you're listening to media or reading content in the English language. Now, when it comes to improving your grammar at the beginner levels of English, you can really keep this simple. You just need to know the basics and you need to know them really well. You do not need to know advanced grammatical rules and techniques in the English language. It really isn't necessary in order to get up to the B1 or the B2 levels. Basic grammar just involves knowing how to use a word in the present tense, in the future tense, or in the past tense. It also involves having the correct order of verbs, nouns, adjectives, etc. when you're speaking in English. This can be very easy to do at the beginner levels if you just get a grammar book in your native language that outlines the differences between your native language and the English language and explains the basic grammatical rules of the English language. This also including the figure of speech in the English language. At the beginner levels, reading goes hand in hand with the application I mentioned earlier called LingQ. You can simply read texts, and if you come across any words that you don't understand, you can just click on it and it will tell you the meaning. This will save you a ton of time because if you read a book or if you read a newspaper and you don't know what a word means, you're going to have to spend countless hours having to research every single word and expression that you don't understand. If you use an application that is meant for reading, this will save you a ton of time. Highly recommended when you're at the beginner levels of English. When it comes to listening at the beginner levels, the most important thing is that you can understand around 80% of the video that you're listening to or the audio that you're listening to. If you're listening to English media where you can barely understand what they're saying, it will not be effective, it will not be efficient, and it will not work. You will quickly learn that you're making no progress when you're listening to media that is too advanced for your current level of English. Instead, make sure that you can understand the majority of what is being said, and then you can almost guess what the other words mean or look them up if you have to. In addition, when you're practicing your listening skills at the beginner level, I always recommend that you should be using subtitles at this level specifically in English. If you really want to challenge yourself, once you feel really comfortable listening with subtitles, try turning the subtitles off. To improve your speaking at the beginner levels, the easiest way is by using the shadowing technique. The shadowing technique simply just involves practicing repeating what you just heard when you're watching a video or when you're listening to an audiobook with text on the screen. Physically train your mouth to say the same thing that you just heard. It really is that simple, so don't get discouraged if you don't see big results in a short period of time. If you do this consistently, I almost guarantee you will see results. The shadowing technique is a technique that has been proven to work for a very long period of time. And finally, when it comes to improving your writing at the beginner levels of English, this is also quite simple. After watching a video or after listening to something in English, simply just write down your opinion on it as best as you can. If you're having trouble articulating something, you can always look it up with a translator at this level of English. Also, there are many spell check tools and grammatical tools out there that will correct your spelling and correct your figure of speech when you're writing, texting, or typing in the English language. And finally, this leads to step number 5, which is just consistency and repetition. This one is surprisingly very hard for most people simply because they get discouraged quite easily when they don't see a lot of results in a very short period of time. If you've been practicing consistently for 3 months and you're not fluent yet, that is totally normal. It's completely normal. Think about it this way. If you're at the A1 level, they say that it could take you almost 200 hours in order to get from the A1 level to the A2 level. And then it could take you another 200 hours to get to the B1 level and another 200 hours to get to the B2 level. That's about 600 hours of studying. If you did 1 hour per a day, it would take you well over a year in order to get from the A1 level up to the B2 level. So understand, even if you've been practicing consistently for 1 year, about 1, maybe even 2 hours per day, you still may not even be fluent after an entire year has passed. It may seem like a long and daunting process to become fluent in English, but I promise you it is well worth it. Once you get to the B2 level, you can really start calling yourself fluent in English, and it will open a ton of doors for you and drastically improve the quality of your life. So to recap, to get from the beginner levels of English to the intermediate levels of English, step number 1, figure out the skill that you need to improve upon the most. Step number 2, create a morning and or evening routine that you know that you can commit to. Step number 3, find a practical method to learn English. Step number 4, steadily improve each skill of the English language. And step number 5, have consistency and as much repetition as possible when it comes to learning English. So after watching this video, what would you say your current level of English is? Leave a comment down below, and I will see you in the next video.